Hello, my dear American friends and English-speaking friends. This is Dr. Shevchenko. Доброго ранку to you. Good morning to you. I'm coming to you from the Ukraine, and I will be talking to you about Mr. Poroshenko, how he lost his race, and how fortunate we are, the people of Ukraine, that it happened because of his criminal activities. And I will cover his father's criminal past. He was imprisoned in federal Soviet prison in 1986 for grand theft, and I will cover, you will see on your screen and you will hear on the audio part, all of Mr. Poroshenko's bank frauds and his activities, where he keeps his money in offshore accounts, and you will see his how his criminal empire basically grew to this incredible size. And so you will be the witness of what the Ukrainian people have been suffering all this time and all the lies that I've been telling in the West. And pardon my English, you know, we all Slavic people have this accent, and I will try to talk like American, but I will do my very best. You know, we typically say, instead of, I'll pick you up at the store, we say, I'll pick you up at store, because we don't have articles. So forgive me. I will try now to speak like an American, try my very best. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Poroshenko's past. So he was born on September 26, 1965, in the small town of Volgograd, which is the Odessa region. It's about 200 miles southwest of Odessa, Ukraine. And of course, you might know Odessa is the largest seaport in Ukraine. His last name is actually, he was born as Valtsman. So his father's name is Alexei Valtsman. In 1986, he was sentenced to a federal, what you might call in America, to the federal penitentiary, like a supermax, or for those who don't know what supermax is a maximum security prison like you have in Leavenworth, Kansas, or in Denver, or in Dallas, or many other locations in California. And so Mr. Poroshenko was basically Mr. Poroshenko Sr., shall we call him, or Mr. Valtsman to be exact. Valtsman is a very common Jewish name in the Odessa region. So for Mr. Peter Poroshenko, the current president of Ukraine, to sort of hide his identity, that's the only reason why he didn't want to use his father's last name, is to not be traced back to his criminal past. What type of criminal activity did he do? By the way, just to give you a sneak preview, you will be hearing the audio tapes of the recorded conversations of Mr. Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, discussing his offshore bank accounts with his Ukrainian and Western bankers on Cyprus, in Luxembourg, in Canada, in the United States, and also in Panama. Panama City happens to be the largest, the epicenter for all the tax fraud and tax evasion. It's the tax haven of the world. There's one company called Mossack Fonseca that handled over 300,000 clients, high-profile clients, such as Mr. Poroshenko, to essentially help launder hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. In the case of Mr. Poroshenko, we're estimating close to $8.5 billion was laundered in the past 5 years. And most of it was federal money coming from the American taxpayers who are working very hard to support the lifestyle of Mr. Poroshenko. Because when Washington gives in and gives another billion or another $500 million in quote-unquote aid to the country of Ukraine, all of that money is being essentially embezzled long before it even gets to the Ukrainian banks. You have to understand it. Don't be naive. Mr. Poroshenko is essentially a master impersonator. You know, when he pretends like he wants money, he comes and cries on your shoulder to Washington. He tells Mr. Putin is a very, very bad man. He drops personally bombs. You know, he goes bombing Ukraine. And, you know, he tells all kinds of things. Mr. Putin personally bombs Ukraine or Ukrainian villages. And he gets the money, and then the money is gone long before it even gets to the city of Kiev. And so it's so obvious when you'll hear Mr. Poroshenko express his inner thoughts on those tapes, you will hear very quickly that he is quite an actor. He's a different kind of a political chameleon. You know, he comes to Washington with tears in his eyes, saying he needs more money, but as soon as he turns around, gets into his car, he says, what a bunch of fucking morons. What a naive race of human beings. You've never seen more naive people than people in Washington, D.C. So that gives you a perspective just how hard-boiled that politician is. So, you know, Washington, D.C. is considered the darkest place on the face of the earth in terms of the coarseness of the people who live and work there. But for Mr. Poroshenko, it's like a sort of like a fun and games type of place. He goes there to entertain himself. He goes there to get some money. He goes there to mostly make fun of all these rural politicians, all those senators from Iowa, from Kansas, from Missouri, from all those states that when he meets them, he greets them, he tells us stories, and they believe him. I mean, for Pete's sake, folks, when you hear on the tapes what he really thinks of you, hopefully it will turn your world upside down, because he's not what he portrays himself to be officially. And you should be able to pick up on that, just being, in politics and being a politician. You should know these things. And if you've known that, that's a different story. If you had your own agenda, why you gave him the money. But, for destabilizing geopolitically the region, that's another agenda that we're not going to get into in this session. But maybe in my next sessions, we'll cover that. But let's get back to Mr. Waltzman, or Mr. Poroshenko's past. Why did his father serve 6.5 years in a maximum security prison? Well, he was supplying drugs, of course, illegal drugs, illegal weapons, and prostitutes from Moldova into Ukraine and other Soviet republics. And that was his business. So as you can see, he didn't steal bicycles from school children. It was hardcore felon, criminal, that taught his son very well from early on, from his early childhood. He told Peter, if you want to get serious, you got to aim high. And with his father's help, with that type of training, you can only imagine, what sort of educational background, quote-unquote education, he got growing up under the auspices of his father, Mr. Poroshenko Sr. And so father to son, Mr. Poroshenko Jr. had learned early on how to behave, how to plan ahead, what type of businesses that he should aim for. And so he owns a candy factory. That's right. Today, he currently owns a candy factory. And what happened, which you will hear in the tapes, you'll see all the evidence on your screen, when he became president of Ukraine in 2014, he promised and he was obligated to forego his business interest in this candy factory, so he promised he was going to sell it, getting into politics, starting his political career in the office. And what he did was another trick, basically. He called his Kiev lawyer, who handled all of his financial affairs for him, who contacted his business associate on the island of Cyprus, which is a Greek-Turkish territory, and who in turn contacted his business associates in Panama City, the country of Panama, at the firm Mossack and Fonseca. And so what was the end result of that transaction? Well, the assets of the candy factory called Roshan were transferred into a trust that was later transferred into a company called Prime Asset Partners Limited. When you see an LLC, obviously it's an American company, but on Cyprus it uses different jurisdictions. So LTD meaning it's sort of a European creation. So Prime Asset Partners holds the assets for the candy factory of Mr. Poroshenko. Then there is a trust that's created. If you don't understand any of this, it's basically a sophisticated financial scheme that is approximately 10 times more elaborate than what your Bernie Madoff did when he bamboozled his investors of over $80 billion. In this particular scheme, we're talking upwards of $200 billion that's gone through this money laundering scheme altogether, of which about $6.5 billion are personally tied to Mr. Poroshenko's financial P&L statements at this point, courtesy of CIA, FBI, and KFX, the radio station that posted all of this wonderful information that they received, I believe, from the CIA and FBI, which Mr. Poroshenko to this day thinks that his phone lines and his Skype conversations are private. He hasn't learned it. All of the, starting with ICQ and WhatsApp, and by the way, it's pronounced WhatsApp, not WhatsApp. WhatsApp means hello, and WhatsApp means it's a play on words. I'm just sort of linguistically making a correction there for all the listeners. But even WhatsApp, that was created by a Ukrainian entrepreneur in the Silicon Valley, Jan something rather Kobin, who came to the United States many years ago. It was actually all the codes, everything was taken by the CIA and the FBI. They have full access to all the conversations, all the text messages, and all those algorithms. So they control everything. So why do you think Facebook is eagerly paying $2 billion a month for the electric bill, for all the storage facilities, for all the servers? Why do you think that goes on? Well, it's because to have access to information. You see, today information is everything. And if you don't have access to information, then you're somewhat deprived. And obviously, if you have unlimited way of printing money and you need access to information, you simply acquire companies like WhatsApp and ICQ and Facebook and Twitter and all other communications companies. And now the Ukrainians have caught on, and they've actually launched their own version of Facebook and Twitter and for example, this famous company Grammarly that's advertised on every corner, so to speak, cyber corner in the West and the United States and other countries. It's a Ukrainian company launched by the Ukrainian, it's funded by the Ukrainian billionaires to sort of steal the information from the American users, just like Facebook does and Twitter and all other companies. They collect all that information and they call it free. As soon as you hear the word free, that means you're getting screwed. Anyway, Mr. Poroshenko hasn't learned that yet, but he will very soon. Much like Julian Assange, Mr. Poroshenko will be orderly escorted by the American security forces to a private jet and flown to the United States to be tried at a federal level for all of the... Well, he simply overstayed his welcome at the White House, basically. He went too far, and now he's going to pay the price. So he's no longer needed, basically. He paid a role, and he sort of overstepped his boundaries. Let's move on a little bit. How he sort of built his empire and, how he treats people. In his surroundings, for instance, when journalists, reporters come up to him, he simply, if he doesn't like him, he grabs the microphone and throws it to the ground and he punches them in the face. You'll see that all. It's all documented. Fortunately, we have some footage to show you how he treats people. Women, for Mr. Poroshenko, are subhuman. They're lower than the property. That used to be in the United States, many years ago. Prior to the federal laws, 1975 federal equal opportunity laws in the United States, when American women could not open their own bank accounts and could not start a business because they were deemed incompetent. So they had to bring a husband or another authority figure like a father to co-sign for them to open a bank account or to start a business, like I said. That is the case of status of women in the Ukraine today. They're deemed as sort of subhuman beings, childlike imbeciles who cannot do anything other than get pregnant and raise children. And Mr. Poroshenko takes it to the next level. To him, women are beyond that. I mean, you'll hear in this conversation how he talks to all of his subordinates, his staff, the person who runs his television show. He basically told them, I'm trying to sort of be true to the translation here so that you get the point, and then compare it to your Al Capone and see if there's any resemblance there. But he says, you motherfucker, if you don't do this right now, I'll cut your fucking balls off. I'm gonna boil you, cut you up into pieces, boil you, and serve you on a silver platter to all the dogs in Kiev. Because there's a lot of stray dogs in Kiev. You have to understand the context here. And that's his sort of a kind, he was in a good mood. He wasn't that mad at that man. He was just a comment meaning, you motherfucker, I'm going to cut you up. Sort of like, you missed the mark, pay attention, watch out, pay closer attention to what you do on a daily basis. The guy just missed something on one of the TV coverages. He didn't cover Mr. Poroshenko enough in his coverage. So anyway, the point is, that's the everyday type of transactions and conversations around Mr. Poroshenko. That's who he is. His father was an incredibly ingenious criminal. It was nothing for Mr. Weizmann or Poroshenko Sr. to use people, to use women for prostitution, to bring drugs into the country, to bring illegal weaponry, and just for the sake of enriching himself. So when Mr. Poroshenko deliberately deceives the Western powers or the Western leaders by saying that Mr. Putin is this or Mr. Putin is that, that's all a lie. That's only to collect the money. The only purpose to, obviously, the reason why he wants to collect the money is not for the benefit of the country of Ukraine. And it's not for the benefit of the Ukrainian people. There's only one purpose. Whenever Mr. Poroshenko gets involved in anything, is to line up his own pocket. So he empties the coffers as soon as the bank transfer hits the account. The bank transfer arrives and it's empty. It's just an incredible mafia-like structure. So essentially, he is the boss. Everybody else underneath him is the underboss, so to speak, using the mafia analogy. It's very sad. Another thing he does, he sponsors the neo-Nazi movement in the Ukraine. This nationalistic movement that you'll see on your screens, where essentially these young, semi-disenfranchised teenagers or young men who are, football fans, or what you might call in America, vagabonds or semi-vagabond, who lead a semi-vagabond lifestyle. he basically pays them a few dollars a month to sort of participate in these meetings, marches, and all of those absolutely unruly gatherings on the streets of Kiev and other cities in the Ukraine.